historical narratives of modern Egypt start with the Napoleonic campaign on Egypt at the very end of the 18th century, when Napoleon Bonaparte led a military campaign on Egypt that landed in Alexandria in 1798. And that's a very logical start because the French campaign, or the Napoleonic campaign on Egypt, marked a true demarcation between what was before that and what came after that. It was the beginning of Egypt's experience with modernity. However, I think that before we begin with the campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte on Egypt, there is a couple of episodes, historical episodes, that took place in the half century before the landing of the French campaign in Alexandria in 1798. The first of these historical episodes is the reign of Ali Bey al-Kabir, or Ali Bey the Great. This is a Mamluk that ruled Egypt in the second half, I think, mid and second half of the 1700s, so of the 18th century. And for those who are not familiar with the word Mamluk, the Mamluks, the literal translation of the word means owned by. So they were effectively slaves historically. They were a warrior class who had been brought to Egypt 6 centuries before that. So in the 1200s, in the 13th century, and some people might even say a bit before that, by the descendants of Salahuddin, the descendants of the very famous warrior Saladin. His descendants decided, for a number of reasons we'll not go into right now, to incorporate into their military structure a warrior class that they had bought as slaves, and most of them either they bought or abducted from different parts of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, relatively very young boys who were taken into the military barracks of the descendants of Salahuddin, referred to historically as the Ayyubides, anyway, and they were brought up since a very young age to be warriors, and of course converted to Islam, and a very interesting way of bringing them up to have absolute loyalty to the rulers who own them, hence that they are Mamluks, they are owned by the royal class that had brought them into Egypt and later on into Turkey, but at the same time they are defendants of not just the sultanate or the kingdom, but also defendants of the faith to a large extent of Islam. The Mamluks ended up taking ownership not just of Egypt, but also of the Levant. And for a number of centuries, they became the power to reckon with in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the period from the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, a number of centuries, they were by far the most powerful player in Egypt and in the Levant, to the extent that they were the ones who ended up expelling the European crusader forces that were in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. They were the ones that stopped the advance, the march of the Tatars or the Mongols that came from the eastern parts or came from Asia all the way to modern day Iraq and all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. It was, or the Mamluks were the ones who stopped the Tatars, expelled the Crusaders. So that gives us a sense of how accomplished they were as a warrior class. However, by the early 16th century, so 1515, 1516, 1517, the rising power in Europe, the Ottomans, decided to expand south. And indeed, Ottoman Sultan Selim I was the one who defeated the Mamluks in 1516 and took ownership of the Eastern Mediterranean, and a year later, 1517, arrived in Egypt. This marked a major change in the power structure in Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, or Egypt and the Levant, or the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole, because the Mamluks, that used to be the key power, the dominant power in that part of the world, effectively became a secondary force under the Ottoman structure. So Egypt, since 1517, if I'm not mistaken, became a province in the Ottoman Empire, with a representative of the Ottoman Sultan in Egypt, and beneath, under that representative, the Mamluks were there as parts of the military structure, parts of the political class, parts even of the administrative class that was ruling the country. And the story continued, or the situation continued like that for the next 2-3 centuries. However, by the 1700s, the Ottomans' power had descended significantly. A lot of the command structure, of the major presence that the Ottomans had, the ability to really quell the situation and control the situation across the vast Ottoman Empire, all of that had changed. A lot of the Ottoman might had been decreased, and that gave or created an opportunity for some ambitious Mamluks to start to assert their own power. One of the most important of those Mamluks, who were for a long time working within the Ottoman structure, under the Ottoman representative in Egypt, was this man I referred to 5 minutes ago or so, Ali Bey the Great. Bey is a title, just basically some sort of a title to give him some sort of distinction relative to others. Why this man merits that we start the story of modern Egypt from his moment in history? Because it was Ali Bey the Great who decided that he will attempt to get Egypt out of the Ottoman Empire, at least to assert some sort of effective independence for Egypt, even if it was not a legalistic independence, meaning that there are debates whether or not this man had tried to really wrench Egypt totally out of the Ottoman Empire. Debates regarding that. But what is not debatable is that he certainly challenged the Ottoman Empire so that he asserts Egyptian independence out of the mechanisms of control of the Ottomans. The second thing he tried to do was to introduce elements of modernity that were very alien to Egypt and to the entire southern Mediterranean basin at the time. By elements of modernity, I very much mean the focus on military equipments, military technology. So this man had the foresight to see that the methods, the military methods, not just of the Mamluks in Egypt, but to a large extent even of the Ottomans, were becoming increasingly obsolete, and that there is a need to incorporate Western, European ways of not just equipment, but also ways of thinking. And that starts with the army, with the military, but it transcends all of that. Because if you want to create a modern army, that takes you by default to the educational system, to the manufacturing base, to the logistical channels. So the second reason Ali Bey the Great merits attention was not only his political ambition, again, to effect some sort of independence for Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, but also that he was the very first person in Egypt in many centuries to try to introduce European modernity, not just militarily, but in general, into Egypt. And the third reason Ali Bey the Great is quite important is that he was the very first to try to some extent, resuscitate the Egyptian empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. Meaning that up to the 1400s, so the 15th century, arguably to the very beginnings of the 1500s, the 16th century, Egypt was at times the real power that controlled the entire Eastern Mediterranean, primarily the Levant, or if not direct control, it had immense influence over the Eastern Mediterranean, meaning that the ruling Mamluks out of Cairo were the ones who either controlled the southern parts of the Mediterranean, of the Levant, or often also the northern parts, Syria. When the Ottomans, as I mentioned earlier, when Selim I, the Ottoman Sultan, defeated the Mamluks, initially in the Levant and then later conquered Egypt, Egypt became just a province in the Ottoman Empire. Its rule, and of course its influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, were effectively lost. In 1700s, in the mid and late 1700s, Ali Bey the Great was the very first person out of Egypt, ruler in Egypt, to try to resuscitate that Egyptian political and military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Ali Bey al-Kabir, or Ali Bey the Great, actually ended up failing in the three objectives he had set out to accomplish. So he did not manage to wrest Egypt out of the Ottoman Empire. He did not actually manage to bring real modernity, whether militarily or in any other domain, to Egypt, nor did he manage to resuscitate or assert Egyptian influence, let alone control, over the Eastern Mediterranean. And to a large extent, that's because it ended up being a one-man show, more or less, the project of Ali Bey the Great. Internally, he did not really have a real body of advisors and associates that he can rely upon. Actually, the most important general of his or associate of his ended up betraying him, which is one of the reasons actually why he ended up losing a lot of what he had tried to accomplish on the Eastern Mediterranean. But to a large extent, if we look at the episode historically, he had great ambitions, but he did not manage to build a structure upon which he can rely to execute the project that he had. And the second point, which I think is important to note, that he did not really have a model in front of him, an international model that he can look at and try to emulate and try to copy, more or less, or at least be inspired by in his project. That's an important point because we will come to that when we talk about Muhammad Ali Pasha, the founder of modern Egypt roughly half a century later. But at this stage, when we look at the failure of Ali Bey the Great, I think that's an important point to bear in mind. Another point to bear in mind why he had failed is that he tried to forge a number of military and political alliances. All of them ended up not really materializing, whether with some of the rulers, also Mamluk rulers in the Levant that he had counted upon in his revolt against the Ottomans. They did not end up really standing by him, and importantly, he had tried to court Russia. It was during the time of Catherine the Great, the very famous empress of Russia, who it seems that she, through her envoys, had sent him some green signals, or more or less made him think that he could or can count on her support, on Russia's support, but in reality that did not happen, and therefore he did not find that support when the time came to challenge the Ottomans. Another point which was important in his confrontation with the Ottomans is that at the time, the legitimacy, whether in Egypt, whether in the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course in Turkey, was an Islamic legitimacy. So for a Mamluk ruler, somebody within the Ottoman structure, to try to have an alliance with a non-Islamic power, such as Russia, of course was not necessarily looked upon favorably by a number of forces in the empire. Arguably, this is one of the reasons why some people who initially were fighting with him decided to desert him, to leave him, because they did not, in their minds, reconcile the idea of working with a European power against the Ottomans. Some people might say that because Ali Bey the Great had failed in the three objectives he had set out to accomplish, then there was no point in really invoking him as an important episode. I disagree with that. I think because he was the very first person in Egypt to try, again, to get Egypt out of the Ottoman Empire and assert its independence, and because he was the very first to try to introduce modernity, European modernity, into Egypt, and because he was the very first who tried to resuscitate the Egyptian empire into the Eastern Mediterranean, even if, or even though, he had failed, the attempt itself merits attention. And I think it merits to be the point of departure for us in the story of modern Egypt.